Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Brookings. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Foreign Policy Program. We're thrilled to have you all here today to discuss the Trump administration's nuclear posture review, an important document that just came out on Groundhog's Day, February 2nd of this year, following the earlier national security strategy of December and the national defense strategy of January. So the administration is really doing a nice job keeping its clockwork running smoothly on issuing all this guidance prior to now the unveiling of its budget request. We're thrilled to have David Trachtenberg beginning our discussion today. He has one of the longer titles, but one of the more important titles in the Pentagon. He's the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, a job that Jim Miller also had, and we'll talk about that in our panel that follows with Jim and others. But for now, I want to introduce David, who has been one of the administration's most important authors and voices on the conceptualization and framing and writing of this document that we now have available, that, by the way, all of you can access, as you're well aware, on the internet. It's about a 70-page document. It's much longer than the unclassified version of the National Defense Strategy. It has a lot of elaboration of Trump administration thinking on a number of issues, and we're going to hear about that today. David will give some short remarks, then field some of your questions, and then we'll swap out a little before the 11 o'clock mark for our panel discussion that I'll moderate and that I'll introduce the panelists for when we get to that point. Let me just say a couple more things about David. This is his second or third or fourth time in government. He was also an important figure in the Bush administration working on international security policy, which means he was thinking a lot about relations with NATO and other allies and thinking about their nuclear posture review of the early 2000s that he was also an important contributor towards. He hails from California by way of college, went to USC, studied foreign service at Georgetown, was involved in a number of jobs in Washington, as I mentioned earlier, including most recently with Shortwave Consulting, a job that he held just before joining the Trump administration last summer when he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate for this job. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. David Trachtenberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here at Brookings. I very much appreciate the invitation. And it's good to see so many people out here on such a dreary morning. Thank you for making the trek out here to participate in this. It's really good to be here, and it's been a while since I've been here, and always appreciate the opportunity to come back. One correction I would note to Michael's very generous introduction, and that is my title, which was indeed the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, has now been changed. It's actually been shortened by one word, thanks to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed into law a couple of months ago or so. The word principal has now been dropped from all the Deputy Undersecretary titles, because there is only one Deputy Undersecretary. And so now I have a better chance of actually fitting my title on a business card. So as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, again, it is my pleasure to be here and to talk about this very critical issue, the nuclear posture review. As you all know, each post-Cold War president has early in his first term conducted a review of U.S. nuclear policy, posture, and programs. President Trump's first national security presidential memorandum, issued 1 week into the new administration, directed Secretary Mattis to undertake the fourth such review of U.S. nuclear policy. The aim of the review was to ensure the United States' nuclear deterrent is modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and appropriately tailored to deter 21st century threats and reassure allies. The Department of Defense conducted this review along with the Departments of State and Energy and in consultation with allies and experts from inside and outside the government. The resulting 2018 Nuclear Posture Review establishes the Department of Defense's priority as maintaining a safe and effective nuclear arsenal that can effectively contribute to 4 key goals: deterring nuclear and non-nuclear attack, assuring allies and partners, achieving U.S. objectives should deterrence fail, and hedging against an uncertain future. The NPR also emphasizes that U.S. nuclear policy will continue to contribute to U.S. nuclear non-proliferation goals. Now, these roles are consistent with past priorities of U.S. nuclear policy. Indeed, the 2018 NPR maintains long-standing nuclear policies adopted by both Democratic and Republican administrations. For example, the new NPR recognizes the need for the nuclear triad and sustains the previous administration's plan for modernizing the aging U.S. nuclear triad of land-based, sea-based, and air-breathing delivery platforms, as well as its supporting nuclear infrastructure and command and control. Consistent with the 2010 NPR conducted by the prior administration, the 2018 NPR declares that the United States would only consider using nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend U.S. vital interests. In addition, the NPR also reaffirms the U.S. commitment to arms control and nonproliferation by maintaining support for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and by sustaining the extended deterrent for allies. Extended deterrence is critical to their security and promotes nuclear nonproliferation by checking their need to acquire their own nuclear weapons. Now, each of the previous NPRs has rightly emphasized that U.S. nuclear policy must be responsive to the threat environment of its time. The 2018 NPR addresses the reality that while the Cold War has been over for decades, a much more challenging nuclear threat environment has developed since the previous 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. This is the reality that confronted the new administration when it began its Nuclear Posture Review. Accordingly, the 2018 NPR is grounded in a realistic assessment of the contemporary security environment, one that recognizes a return of great power competition and the increasing salience of nuclear weapons in the arsenals and doctrines of potential adversaries. For example, since 2010, the Russian leadership has made repeated, explicit nuclear threats to U.S. NATO allies and others, brandishing Russian nuclear weapons in a way we really had not seen since the height of the Cold War. Russia is actively modernizing and expanding its strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons, and doing so in continuing violation of the landmark 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty. Like Russia, China is pursuing expansionist moves at the expense of its neighbors, including key U.S. allies, and doing so also through the threat of force. China also continues to expand its nuclear capabilities in both quantity and quality. Since 2010, China has announced the development of, or fielded, new ICBMs and theater-range ballistic missiles, a new sea-launched ballistic missile, a new ballistic missile submarine, and a new strategic bomber. China's intentional lack of transparency regarding the scope and scale of its nuclear modernization serves only to magnify uncertainties about its future intent. Also, since 2010, North Korea has rapidly increased the pace of its nuclear testing and of theater, intercontinental, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. At the same time, North Korea has repeatedly made explicit nuclear threats to the United States and our allies in the region. And while Iran's nuclear future remains uncertain, its malign activities and hegemonic aspirations in the Middle East are not. Now, in contrast to these developments over the past decade, the United States has built no new types of nuclear weapons or delivery systems, other than the F-35, for the past 2 decades. We have instead sustained our nuclear deterrent with life extension programs, keeping systems and platforms decades beyond their designed service life. Former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter rightly observed that if there is an arms race underway, the United States clearly is not a participant. It is clear that our attempts to lead by example in reducing the numbers and salience of nuclear weapons in the world have not been reciprocated. Since the 2010 NPR, the prospects for great power military confrontation have expanded, while both Russia and China have increased the number and salience of their nuclear weapons programs. The intentional restraint reflected in U.S. nuclear policies did not lead the rest of the world to follow the same path. Now, this is not a unique conclusion reflected in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. The U.S. National Intelligence Council recognized this great difference in the U.S. and Russian approaches to nuclear weapons back in 2012, concluding, quote, "Nuclear ambitions in the U.S. and Russia over the last 20 years have evolved in opposite directions. Reducing the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. security strategy is a U.S. objective, while Russia is pursuing new concepts and capabilities for expanding the role of nuclear weapons in its security strategy," end quote. The 2018 NPR responds to this increasingly challenging threat environment not by changing long-standing tenets of U.S. nuclear policy that have bipartisan support, but by emphasizing the maintenance of those capabilities needed to effectively deter war in the current environment. It also seeks to clarify U.S. policies to help remove the potential for mistaken calculation by potential adversaries that limited nuclear first-use threats or escalation can provide them with any possible useful political or military advantage. Correcting the potential for such calculations is now a key to maintaining deterrence of nuclear war. In this regard, I'd like to address 3 of the corresponding outcomes of the 2018 NPR: the clarification of our nuclear policy and the recommended supplements to U.S. deterrence capabilities, all of which have been subject to considerable news accounts and what I would consider to be considerable mischaracterizations in much of the public commentary. First, let me say the 2018 NPR returns deterrence of nuclear attack against us, our allies and partners, to the top priority of U.S. nuclear policy. Given the security environment and the changes in that environment that I have highlighted, this is a prudent, realistic, and I would argue necessary change. Second, to strengthen deterrence of nuclear and non-nuclear strategic attacks, the 2018 NPR clarifies U.S. declaratory policy regarding nuclear weapons. Doing so does not expand the circumstances for nuclear use or lower the nuclear threshold, as some commentators have suggested. Rather, while maintaining a measure of ambiguity, it provides some clarification regarding what might constitute an extreme circumstance that could lead to U.S. consideration of a possible nuclear response. This clarification enhances deterrence and raises the nuclear threshold by reducing the potential for adversary miscalculation. As potential adversary non-nuclear capabilities continue to become more and more lethal, U.S. policy must make clear that non-nuclear strategic attacks that would have catastrophic effects on the American people and our allies must also be deterred. Finally, in addition to prioritizing deterrence and adding some clarity to extreme circumstances, the 2018 NPR also recommends 2 nuclear programs to strengthen U.S. capabilities to deter attacks and to assure allies. First is the modification of a small number of existing submarine-launched ballistic missiles to include a low-yield option. Second is the pursuit of a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. Despite the awesome capabilities of our existing nuclear triad, Russia's actions indicate that Moscow may hold the mistaken belief that its numerous and diverse non-strategic nuclear arsenal provides useful options for limited first-use nuclear threats or employment. We believe the 2 supplements to the U.S. nuclear arsenal presented in the NPR are important to help correct this misperception and convince Russia and any other potential adversary that the United States and its allies will not be coerced by the threat of limited nuclear first use. Now, the other point I would make is that neither of these capabilities, these 2 supplemental capabilities, is a new capability. The low-yield option for submarine-launched ballistic missiles involves a relatively minor modification to an existing warhead. And the sea-launched cruise missile is a capability that the United States possessed for decades until recently. In addition, neither of these capabilities will require underground nuclear testing, and both are compliant with all U.S. treaty obligations. These capabilities are intended to strengthen the deterrence of war and the assurance of allies, thereby helping to ensure that nuclear weapons are not employed or proliferated. We must recognize that effective deterrence is about tailoring our capabilities to a potential adversary's calculations regarding the use of nuclear force to ensure that it can never appear to be a useful option. We must assess our capabilities relative to the doctrine, exercises, statements, threats, and behavior of potential adversaries. And the capabilities recommended by the 2018 NPR are tailored to raise the threshold for nuclear use and to do so with minimal changes to the U.S. nuclear posture. We believe the policy announced in the NPR is a reasonable response to the changes in the current security environment. Now, let me be clear. The goal of our recommendations, the goal of the recommendations contained in the 2018 NPR, is to deter war, not to fight one. Modernization of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, adoption of tailored defense strategies with flexible capabilities, and clarification on the role of nuclear weapons all send a strong deterrence message to potential adversaries while also reassuring our allies. Finally, the 2018 NPR helps ensure that our diplomats speak from a position of strength. Russia has little incentive to negotiate seriously about nuclear reductions without a robust and ongoing U.S. nuclear modernization program. Indeed, Russian leaders have said as much. And as Secretary Mattis recently testified, Russia is unlikely to give up something to gain nothing. Critics who favor eliminating U.S. systems in the face of an expansive Russian nuclear modernization effort are undermining America's greatest bargaining leverage and the prospects for future arms agreements. The 2018 Nuclear Posture Review is one of several important reinforcing U.S. national security documents meant to guide U.S. policy in an increasingly complex and challenging world. Much as we might prefer otherwise, U.S. nuclear weapons are the bedrock of American and allied security. As Colin Gray has said, nuclear weapons are a regrettable necessity in the real world. After the slaughter of 2 world wars, they have prevented large-scale great power conflict for more than 7 decades. In an era of renewed great power competition, adversaries, allies, and the American people should know that the United States has the will and the flexible, resilient nuclear forces needed to protect the peace. Before turning things back over to Michael and the panel here for discussion, let me again take this opportunity to thank the Brookings Institution for the opportunity to come here today to briefly present the department's work and to engage in an informed discussion on these issues that are tremendously vital to our nation's security. I appreciate your being here and your attention, and I look forward to your questions and insights. Thank you all very much. Questions? Comments? Suggestions? Recommendations? Yes, sir.
Please wait for a microphone if you could, so we can get this immortalized on C-SPAN. So does anyone have a microphone, please, in the back? All the way towards the front here on the left.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you are going to get involved in a low-yield weapon exchange, how do you figure you're going to prevent it from escalating to more conventional size nuclear weapons?
I don't think of it in terms of getting involved in an exchange at all. The way we look at this, again, is what we are trying to do is we are trying to prevent an exchange, not engage in one. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us to think about how do we do that in a world that has changed dramatically since the last NPR was done and reflects developments by Russia and other states that tend to suggest increased reliance on nuclear weapons and the possibility that nuclear weapons, even in a limited way, might have some degree of political or military utility. And so the recommendations that we're proposing to include a low-yield ballistic missile and a sea-launched nuclear-armed cruise missile are intended not to engage or not to fight a nuclear war or not to even suggest that one could be fought in a way that is limited, however one wants to define the term limited, but are designed to try to convince adversaries and potential opponents that they should not feel that they have some exploitable advantage by using a capability for which the United States has no counter. So the very purpose of what we're doing is war prevention, not war fighting. And I understand the characterizations many of the characterizations that I have seen tend to suggest that what we are looking to do is engage in precisely the kind of limited strikes that your question suggests. I'd suggest looking at it differently. What we're trying to do is prevent an opponent from believing that such a course of action is actually useful or beneficial.
So you believe a small deterrent is more effective than a big deterrent? I'm talking about the size of nuclear weapons, or the explosive yield of nuclear weapons.
Sure. What we believe is having flexible nuclear capabilities tailored to specific circumstances makes the most sense for deterrence and for assurance. Obviously, no two states are alike. We have multiple threats that we are trying to deter, and to do that may take flexible capabilities. In some cases, certain types of military capabilities may be sufficient for deterrence. In other cases, opponents may see them as less sufficient. So what we are trying to do is ensure that there is a necessary flexibility and resilience and robustness in terms of the capabilities we have at our disposal in order to deter, dissuade opponents from believing they have any kind of military advantage that they believe they can use either to initiate conflict or escalate conflict. That is the entire purpose of the recommendations that you find in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. Sir.
Hi, thank you. I would like to know if you're concerned that enhancing nuclear capabilities can be seen as a contradiction to the commitment that you mentioned of non-proliferation agreements, and if it can also promote an arms race.
I would answer this way. First of all, I don't see it as a contradiction whatsoever. In fact, I mentioned our extended deterrent that we extend to over 24 plus allies overseas. I would argue that our nuclear arsenal, the arsenal that we have that serves that extended deterrent function, is quite possibly the most successful non-proliferation tool we've had in our toolkit, literally for decades, because it has dissuaded friends and allies from feeling the need to develop or acquire nuclear weapons of their own. So from a non-proliferation standpoint, the nuclear capabilities we have, I think, very much support U.S. non-proliferation objectives. In terms of the question about an arms race, I've seen that commentary as well a number of times. I go back to the statement that I read from former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. There's an arms race. The United States is not participating. In fact, the United States has not been participating for quite some time. If you look at the details of what the Russian Federation has been doing in terms of its own nuclear modernization program, if you look at Russian military doctrine, if you look at the exercises, the strategic force exercises that Russia has conducted, a number of which really have been unrivaled since the days of the Cold War, a number of which involve the exercise of their strategic nuclear forces and, in fact, the simulated first use of nuclear weapons. If you look at all of the systems that the Russians have been engaged in modernizing in recent years, it's very difficult for me to understand how what we are proposing to do in this nuclear posture review in terms of maintaining the efficacy of the existing triad and developing these two supplemental, I believe very modest supplemental capabilities that I mentioned, in any way, shape, or form heralds an arms race. We're not looking to match what Russia is doing weapon for weapon. We're not looking to do to build up the thousands of non-strategic nuclear weapons that the Russians have in their arsenal. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to convince potential adversaries, whether it be Russia, China, North Korea, whomever, that there is no benefit to them of pursuing a course of action which might lead to their actual use of nuclear weapons first, or in some kind of so-called limited way. What we want to do is make absolutely certain that the costs to an opponent, to an aggressor, of any nuclear use far outweigh any perceived benefits that they might think would accrue to them. That is the essence of what we have recommended in this NPR. And again, I would argue it's relatively consistent with sort of the traditional U.S. nuclear policies as they have evolved over many decades. So again, I think there is much more continuity to this particular NPR and its conclusions and recommendations vis-a-vis prior NPRs than differences. There's a lot of continuity there, and that continuity has been occasionally overlooked.
Thank you, sir. I come from a country that was under an extended nuclear deterrence relationship with the United States, New Zealand, but then decided that our security would be better if we were non-nuclear and not a nuclear target. So we withdrew from that nuclear deterrence relationship. And we're now signed the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Would you be supportive of other of the allies of the United States deciding that for their national interests they would be more secure not to be in a nuclear alliance and also signing the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons?
Well, of course, it's up to individual states and individual allies to decide what approach they want to take. But I will tell you, we have had similar discussions and debates in the NATO context for many years. NATO remains a nuclear alliance. I don't see that changing in the near future. There is a general recognition among allies that nuclear deterrence remains important. I think there's also a general recognition that because of some of the changes that I alluded to that have taken place in the world environment in recent years, the issue of preventing nuclear conflict has taken on a growing importance, and the role of nuclear weapons in doing that is also generally recognized by allies. So I don't want to obviously speak for what other countries should or shouldn't do, but I think it's clear not only to the United States, but it's clear to U.S. allies abroad as well, many of whom share our threat perceptions and understanding of some of the dangers that we see posed by others, and share our recognition that it is critically important, perhaps more so now than ever before, to make sure we have the wherewithal and the capabilities and the resolve to ensure that potential adversaries do not miscalculate and do not believe they have some kind of advantage that is exploitable, that they can take advantage of. So I think that is in the sort of mainstream of U.S. nuclear tradition. I don't see anything odd or unusual about that. But again, whether we like nuclear weapons or we don't, we might all wish that we lived in a world without them. But we also have to recognize reality, and the reality is nuclear weapons do exist. Some states have gone in a direction quite opposite the direction that the United States has gone in terms of the size of its nuclear arsenal and its attention to its focus on nuclear weapons as part of its national security strategy. That's a disquieting development in my view. And it's one that we need to be forthright in confronting, straightforward. Yes, sir.
I appreciate your presentation. Thank you for it. And I've learned a lot from it. But I wonder whether your approach may, in fact, run afoul of some of the very things that you warn other people about, particularly thinking about how other countries will view our strategy. When we decide to build new non-strategic nuclear weapons, why will that not appear to Russia and to other countries to be a ratification of their new strategy of escalation to de-escalate and an acceptance of limited nuclear war? And why is it that the administration decided to focus only or predominantly upon nuclear responses to a possible limited nuclear attack rather than looking to the area of conventional response in which we have such an overwhelming superiority? Remembering, of course, that in the old days when we thought the Russians had a conventional superiority, we were the ones who believed in first strike.
Let me say this. There is nothing in the Nuclear Posture Review that assumes an automatic nuclear response to any particular contingency. There is an element of strategic ambiguity there, which absolutely does not rule out our ability to respond in other ways as well, in ways of our choosing, appropriately to the nature of the threat that we face. That could be response with conventional arms. It could be some other type of response. There is nothing in the NPR that says the United States, under this or that circumstance, will respond with nuclear weapons. There's no automaticity there. And so your point about other possible types of response is certainly valid, and it's not negated by anything in the Nuclear Posture Review. Why is the focus of this review on nuclear weapons? Because it is a Nuclear Posture Review. And the tasking was to review U.S. nuclear posture. So that, of course, is what the review did. In terms of the possible reactions of Russia, China, and other states, I have no doubt that anything the United States does or proposes to do would likely generate negative reactions on the part of those who would prefer the United States not to take any action at all to bolster or improve its nuclear deterrent capabilities. So it's not surprising to read or hear statements from Russian officials or Chinese officials or North Korean officials that are critical of the Nuclear Posture Review and suggesting that the Nuclear Posture Review does precisely the opposite of what it is intended to do. But I think the document itself has to be taken as a whole. And I think the context that is provided within the review itself in terms of our assessment of the overall nuclear security environment provides a realistic framework and rationale for understanding why we have come to the conclusions and recommendations we have come to. Now, look, I realize certainly reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements over this or that specific recommendation or the rationale behind it. That's what makes debate over this issue so robust. But nevertheless, I would encourage everyone, if you haven't read the full document, I'd encourage you to do that. Take a look at how the security environment is described and assess the conclusions and recommendations of the NPR in the context of our assessment. See whether or not it holds together and makes sense as you do that. I think it is a logical approach. I think it is a rational approach. And I think it's an approach that is, in fact, tailored to the kinds of 21st century threats we currently confront and are likely to confront in the future. So regardless of what some opponents might suggest, I think we've kind of hit it right in this particular review. I think it's balanced. I think it's consistent with what U.S. nuclear policy has been by and large for decades. And I think it's appropriately tailored to the different threats that we face today. Sure, Bob.
Dave, thanks so much for joining us at Brookings today and making the case for the Trump NPR. To achieve its ambitious objectives, modernization of the triad, the DOE nuclear complex, command and control system, the supplements you mentioned, and so forth. These are expensive. There's a high price tag associated with them. You're going to need strong bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. Presumably you and other senior officials have engaged in consultations with members of Congress to make the case for the NPR and to get their support. How have those consultations gone? Are you confident that you're going to have the necessary domestic consensus for this ambitious program? And what are the particular challenges? What are the 2 or 3 challenges? When you think of the talking points you're going to use in the Congress, what are the challenges you need to confront?
Very, very good question. And I would say so far, our discussions with others, with folks on the Hill and elsewhere, Democrats, Republicans, I would generally characterize them as overwhelmingly positive. Obviously, not everybody supports everything that we have proposed here in the Nuclear Posture Review. There are some that believe we go too far. There are others who believe we don't go far enough, which again just goes to show you in Washington you can't please everyone, all of the time. But I think by and large, I have been quite pleased by what I have seen as generally bipartisan support for what we have done and what we are attempting to do with this particular NPR. Again, it's not universal, but it's quite substantial, I would argue. The biggest challenges, I think, are several-fold. Number one, explaining the rationale behind what it is we're proposing in a way that is understandable. This is, of course, and everyone here in this room knows it, this is a very esoteric issue. But it's an issue, because of that, it's also an issue that occasionally lends itself to mischaracterization or misinterpretation. Explaining what we are proposing to do and why we are proposing to do it in a way that makes sense to multiple audiences, I think is a challenge, but is critically important to do if we are going to not only generate but maintain a level of bipartisan support that is needed to actually carry out the recommendations that we have proposed here. The other challenge, of course, and you alluded to it in your question, is the issue of funding. No question that what we are talking about carries a substantial price tag. Just the very modernization of our existing triad is not an inexpensive undertaking. Relatively speaking to other things that we spend defense dollars on, it's a relatively minor fraction overall of the defense budget, maybe some 3 to 4%, which historically is rather low if you look at past periods of modernization and recapitalization of the triad. So, from my perspective, it's not so much a question of affordability. We can afford to do what we need to do when we're talking about such weighty issues as preventing nuclear war. Secretary Mattis likes to say, we can afford survival. And he's absolutely right. We can afford to do that. We simply need to be able to, number one, understand that doing so will require time. This is not something that will be done overnight, and it will require a commitment of resources that must be sustained over a period of time to get us to the point where we've actually achieved the objectives we've set forth. That in itself is a reasonably heavy lift. I would argue that as difficult as it was for us to spend the last year sort of constructing the NPR in a way that is reflective of the current security environment, that was probably the easy part. Now that we've done it, that easy part is over. The hard part will be trying to ensure that the recommendations are sustainable and actually carried out in order to accomplish the objectives that we've set forth from a policy prescription. So the challenge is just beginning. And by the way, this is a challenge that will last well beyond this administration into the next administration. Again, this is not something that can be done overnight or with a flick of a switch.
So I'll now ask the panel to join me on stage. We're not going to take any break. We'll just go straight into that. But please join me as well in thanking Secretary Trachtenberg.